And then this week, it was the Montreal Screwjob. 22 years later, we are still talking about this damn match. Bret Hart was leaving. He didn't want to drop the title to Shawn Michaels in Canada because Shawn said he wouldn't be willing to do the same for Bret if he was asked. So Bret said, fine, I'll lose to anybody but him. I'll drop the title at Madison Square Garden to the Brooklyn fucking Brawler before I lose it to this man in Montreal. So they double-crossed him to get the belt off of him. WWE went on to great prosperity. Bret went to WCW, which ended up killing his career. Now he's in the Hall of Fame twice, and some reject in a Rasta cap recently tried to assassinate him. That's the Cliff Notes version of what happened. They interviewed Bret for this special. No Shawn Michaels. No Vince McMahon. No WWE cooperation really at all. They had Bruce Prichard, but this was before he went back to WWE, I believe. He was there, Prichard was, in the back that night at the gorilla position. Earl Hebner was interviewed. He was the referee for the match that night. Eric Bischoff, who added nothing to this. Scott Hall, who thinks everything is just one big work. I'm not even sure why he was interviewed, other than to get the contrarian point of view. Jim Cornette, who shared a big revelation on this show, which I'll get to. And Vince Russo, who was working on creative at the time alongside Cornette. And you know that anything with Russo and Cornette on it is just going to degenerate into something not suitable for younger audiences. So that's the setup to this here. Now, Bret agreed to do this. He was the star of the documentary. It was all about him, right? But it's gotta suck for him to still have to talk about this stuff because he said years ago that he finally came to peace with what happened, and yet he still gets asked about it all the time and gets comments from people saying, oh, he's so bitter. Why is he still talking about it? He only talks about it because he gets asked about it constantly. Is he supposed to have a smile on his face when he's talking about this? The only time he has a smile on his face is when he describes in detail how he punched Vince McMahon in the face and lifted him up off the ground. You could see how much he beams with pride when he tells that story, as he did on here. But back then, yeah, Bret took things very seriously. He compared the idea of losing to Shawn Michaels in Montreal to having his brains blown out. Which, in his book, after he showed Owen a screening of his Wrestling with Shadows movie that came out, he said that was the one part that Owen really took issue with and said he didn't like. And he reminded Bret what they used to say when they were first coming up, which is that nothing in wrestling is worth dying for. Which is just way too sad and way too eerie to think about when you consider how Owen died. But Shawn Michaels does not come across well and is not there to defend himself. And frankly, there is no defense other than to say, I was just doing my job. Because even Shawn Michaels would tell you that back then, he was a prick. Even when WWE had Jim Ross host a DVD with Bret and Shawn talking about nothing but the Screwjob, Shawn didn't really have a whole lot to say. And Vince McMahon's alleged defense to Bruce Prichard when Prichard asked him about it days later, days after the pay-per-view. Because Bruce claims that he didn't know what was going to happen, and he was upset. He was pissed off that nobody clued him in. Vince, this is Vince's defense. Vince told him it was done as first of all, a favor to Bruce, because Bruce doesn't know what Bruce doesn't know. It protected him from anything blowing back on him, because he didn't know. And he also defended Shawn Michaels to Bruce by telling him that we all have Shawn Michaels to thank for saving our company, and thus saving Bruce's job and his family, I guess, from financial ruin. Implying that Shawn, had he not gone along with it, bad things would have happened. But he did go along with it. He took a lot of heat for what happened, which he did. Bret, I guess the idea that Bret would have waltzed into WCW with their championship, or WCW would have at least promoted the fact on TV the next night that they had signed away the WWF champion, and I guess the company would have ceased to exist, or something like that. You should be thanking Shawn Michaels for the sacrifice that he made. He's like wrestling Jesus. He nearly died for our sins. What a nonsensical bullshit argument. Prichard also said, in describing things, that it was Bret's last night in the company, and that may have been what he was led to believe, But it was not Bret's last night in the company. That is a lie. And by no means am I saying that Bret Hart is some innocent casualty and doesn't bear any blame or any responsibility for anything that happened here. But some people have convinced themselves that this was his last match or his last night. He was still under contract to the company for several more weeks, in fact, into December. He didn't even debut on WCW television until mid-December. It's not as though he would have been free to walk onto Nitro the next night. He couldn't, and Vince knew that. Maybe Bruce didn't. But that is just simply not true. Then there's Earl Hebner. I miss Earl. I miss those slow, dramatic counts he would make in those big main events. Made those matches feel more special than a lot of the ones we see today. I know some people hated when he would do that, but I loved it. Hebner's story is that he was on the flight to Montreal when somebody who turned out to be Bret upgraded him to a first-class seat. So he could sit next to Bret, and Bret could ask him if he was going to pull any funny business or if he would screw him over. And Earl swore on his kids that he would never backstab Bret like that because Bret had his suspicions. Bret was not completely dumb to the idea that something like this might happen. Even Vader, backstage that very night, was telling Bret, don't put yourself in any submissions. Because Vader, he worked in Japan and may have seen similar things go down. People were warning Bret. They were telling him, Bret's not a dumb person. He kind of, maybe in his mind, he rationalized, this guy's not really going to do something like that to me. But it's not as though he didn't think it or have people in his ear telling him to be careful. So he's out here on this plane here, upgrading Earl, according to Earl Hebner, upgrading him and trying to get him to make a pledge or a promise that he would never do anything like that. And Earl swore on his kids that he would never backstab Bret like that. Then as he's getting ready to walk out to the ring, Jerry Briscoe pulls Earl Hebner aside and tells him to ring the bell when Shawn puts him in the sharpshooter. And Earl hesitates and says, well, I don't know if I can do that. And Briscoe tells him, is Bret paying your salary? This is from Vince. This is what Vince wants you to do if you want to continue to work here and keep your job. And you could see him as Earl is talking about this, getting visibly teary-eyed as he says that he basically, it ruined his life. It still bothers him to this day. Even though he and Bret made up a long time ago, it still bothers him to this day. No matter where he goes, he still gets chants of you screwed Bret. I mean, hell, Vince McMahon was getting chants of you screwed Bret on TV this week in Montreal on SmackDown. It's a chant that has lived on after all these years. But he's so upset about this, Earl Hebner is. He sells t-shirts that say, you're damn right I did on them. Are you kidding me? Hey, look. The guy is I was going to say he's a savvy businessman, unless you believe the story about why he and his brother were fired from WWE, then he's not so savvy. But he's trying to be a savvy businessman here. Sell t-shirts. But you know what? You can't be too upset if for years, and maybe he's still doing it, I don't know, but I was at plenty of TNA shows where he would be wearing that shirt and he would be selling them at the concession stand for $10 a pop. So, you know what? Save your tears. He, too, is part of the, it's a work brigade. Or so he said. He was on Busted Open Radio this week talking about the documentary, Earl Hebner was. And he had Bully Ray questioning him about it. And he basically said he believes it's a work. So he's part of that whole brigade. Scott Hall was interviewed. I'm not sure why. He came across really badly by basing his theory that the whole thing was a work on two things. Number one, that the camera showed Bret spitting on Vince McMahon, even got a close-up of the spit on Vince's face and in his hair, and they lingered on it, and that if it was a shoot, they never would have aired that during the show. Well, of course, they never did air that during the pay-per-view. That was footage they had in their archives that they showed years later. I'm talking specifically about this tight shot that he makes reference to. I know they caught Bret spitting outside the ring. They weren't really showing that. They were kind of showing Shawn's reaction when he sat up when the match was over. I'm not talking about that. He mentions the loogie and him wiping it away. That did not air during the live pay-per-view. So that's theory number one debunked. Theory number two is that, well, if it was real, why would they show Bret painting the initials WCW with his fingers in the air? Again, that never aired during the pay-per-view. That was footage they had that was used after the fact, when they were either trying to pop a rating for a TV special or to sell DVDs. So if that's what Scott Hall is basing his opinion on, I mean, look, you can have the opinion that you think it was a work. He cited specific examples of why he believes that to be true. And when you cite examples like that, then it's a pretty flawed opinion. It is a flawed opinion when the two things you cite as evidence never even happened. And then there's Jim Cornette. Jim Cornette's big revelation that he was the one who initially pitched the idea and planted the seed with Vince McMahon for a double cross at Survivor Series. Now, it is and it isn't a revelation because Cornette has talked about this in shoot interviews before, but this is the first time I believe that he has not only said that he pitched the idea, but that he even suggested the sharpshooter spot as a finish, as a way out at the end of the match. He, in the documentary, cited the match in 1931 between Strangler Lewis and Henri Deglaine, which also, coincidentally, took place in Montreal, the first Montreal Screwjob. Lots of screwing going on in Montreal, apparently. I wonder what the birth rate is in that city. In the second fall of that match, Deglaine faked a bite mark on his body, which got Strangler Lewis disqualified, and he won the championship. So Vince put him on the spot in this booking meeting, in this creative meeting, and Cornette said, just screw him. You know what? Screw him. Let's screw him and take the title. And at first, Vince waved off the idea. He didn't seem too enthusiastic about it. But the seed was planted. And it just went from there. He claims he had no idea that Vince was actually going to go with the idea until he was in the back at Survivor Series, like everybody else that night, watching on a monitor. And he saw it happening in real time. He saw Shawn step in for the sharpshooter, hook the legs, turn over. And at that point, he's realizing, holy shit. Because he thought that they were just going to go with some kind of a disqualification finish. He was either at the gorilla position or near the gorilla position. He saw Owen Hart and the British Bulldog. They were waiting for their cue. They were of the impression they were going to run in for the disqualification. So he sees them waiting, and that's what he's expecting. Then he sees Shawn going for the sharpshooter spot, and that's when he starts to realize, holy shit, he's actually going to use the finish. And then he got the hell out of there. He joked that he even beat Earl Hebner and both Hebner brothers to the car because he didn't want to be around in case anything blew back on him. He didn't know if people knew or thought that the idea was his. Same thing when he got to the building for Raw the very next night because there were a lot of very angry wrestlers. Mick Foley refused to even show up. He was boycotting the show that night. Cornette on his podcast a few days ago said that Vince told him to go call Cactus and get him to come back to work. Cornette didn't know what he was walking into when he got to the arena because he had no idea who knew what. So here's my take. Cornette may have planted the initial idea, and there is some debate even about that it was Vince who actually initially kind of floated the idea. He had remembered the original Screwjob where they had Moolah under the mask as Spider Lady take the title from Wendy Richter. Richter was making a fuss at the time about wanting more money in a new contract and was just at odds with Vince McMahon about it. And there's a story about Gorilla Monsoon coming to her at the Madison Square Garden the day of the show with a new contract in hand for her to sign. But she said, I want my lawyer to look it over first, and that's when they move forward with their Screwjob plan. I don't know if that part, the Monsoon part, is true, but there's one story that Vince, as being the one to initially mention the idea of maybe some kind of a Screwjob when it came to Bret and Shawn. The point is, the idea was broached, and what I believe happened is that other people slowly began to get on board with the idea. Now, maybe Russo did too. Although Russo, in the very next clip here in this documentary, claimed that he was the one who came up with the double cross. I did it, bro. Okay, bro. It was all my idea, bro. After all these years, people have been crediting the wrong Vince with screwing Bret Hart It was me, bro. I screwed Bret Hart because it had to be done, bro. It had to be done. Bret was being difficult. He didn't want to do the job and lose the WWF title. And I thought, it's just wrestling, bro. Okay, it's just wrestling. I also pitched for it to be a pole match, bro, so that when Bret climbs up to reach for the belt, I push a button in the back, bro, and the pole suddenly gets 10 feet taller, and he can't reach it. But we couldn't find the right pole, so we couldn't do it. Bro, it would have been great. Anyway, of the two, I never skip an opportunity. It's been a while since I've done my Russo. I'm a little rusty, but of the two, Cornette and Russo, however obsessed Cornette might be, not even might be, however obsessed Cornette is about Vince Russo, I believe Cornette's story over him. The devil is in the details. Jim Cornette has all the little details to paint the picture of what happened. He did a follow-up on his podcast that I listened to when I heard he was doing something on Montreal. I knew I was going to talk about this. I said I have to listen in case he adds more information or whatever. I want to make sure I got it right. So I listened to the show that he did, him and his co-host, and he goes into more details of it. Now, only a handful of people. He only told a handful of people over these, how many years it's been now? 20 years? 20 plus years? Only a handful of people even knew that he had initially pitched the idea first to Vince McMahon. Dave Meltzer was one of them. And for years, Meltzer said that he promised that he would not reveal that person's name until they were dead. And after Cornette came out with it on the special, somebody tweeted at Dave and they said, "Hey, Dave, was Cornette the person that you were referring to all these years?" And Meltzer said, yes, it was him. And I believe him. But I also think that Triple H bears responsibility in this as well. That's why I think you cannot just lay this at one person's feet. I think the idea was already there. Then Vince had his infamous phone call, conference call, whatever, with Shawn Michaels and Triple H a few days before the pay-per-view, because by that point, the two of them were basically attached at the hip. And supposedly, as the story goes over all these years, Triple H spoke up during that call when it looked like maybe they were having second thoughts and maybe they were waffling, or Shawn was getting very emotional about the whole thing. He was all stressed out. And Triple H spoke up and said, listen, he said something to the effect of, if he won't do business, we'll do business for him. He's leaving to go to the enemy. He's leaving to go to WCW. We've got to get that belt off of him. And then it went from there. But Cornette on his podcast said it was just mentioned as a what if. It was a what if finish because Vince put him on the spot in this meeting. The only people in the meeting when this happened were Vince McMahon, Jim Cornette, and Vince Russo. And Vince put him on the spot. They were having trouble coming up with a finish. He dared him to come up with something. And he thought, what the fuck? He never uses any of my ideas, save for the Hell in a Cell stuff the month before with Shawn and Undertaker. He said he pitched the idea to Vince of creating this giant cage that engulfs the entire ringside area, which is an idea he got from, I think he said he got it from Mid-South or one of the, I don't recall which territory it was, but he cited the territory that he had gotten the idea from, and the idea for Kane to rip the door off its hinges when he made his debut came from an old angle, he said, that he saw with Kevin Sullivan that he remembered. Vince used those ideas, but otherwise, for all the time that Cornette spent in creative, he joked that Vince never used any of my ideas. But this one he uses. And the irony of it all, he said, is that as someone who always works so hard to uphold kayfabe in wrestling, he wasn't like, Cornette was not a fan of the curtain call. Even now, to this day, he goes off on any little thing that kind of exposes the business. He's gotten into Twitter wars with people like Joey Ryan, and it's comical at this point. Whenever there's some kind of spot like that at like an indie show, the first thing people do is they tag Jim Cornette because they know that it's going to just make his head explode. So he's always been like that. And the irony of all of this is that as somebody who always works so hard to uphold this idea of kayfabe in pro wrestling, that as someone who did that, he ended up being the one who did more with that one finish to expose the wrestling business than any other finish in the history of professional wrestling. And he was apologetic on his podcast to Bret Hart, who probably is hearing all this for the first time as far as him being the one to initially pitch the idea. He apologized to Bret. He says, I didn't want to screw Bret. Bret was the one that I liked. He goes, I would have rather double-crossed Shawn Michaels and fucked him over. But the last leg of this documentary just turned into Jim Cornette and Vince Russo spouting off about one another, and it ended with Cornette promising to live long enough to piss on Vince Russo's grave. His wife knows he has left her explicit instructions that even if he is incapacitated and has to be wheeled over, he will piss on this man's grave. Well, he certainly has a knack for being colorful. I'll give him that. But I will say this though, to harbor that much hatred for one person cannot be healthy. I know Cornette's lost a lot of weight over the years, but even still, for his blood pressure's sake, I don't see how just carrying all this hatred around for one person could possibly be a healthy thing. Entertaining? Yeah, sure. But healthy? Probably not. At the end of the day, I'll wrap up with this. Everybody involved bears at least some responsibility for what happened, but there is no one person, in my mind, more so responsible than Vince McMahon. He is the one who signed Bret to a 20-year contract. He is the one who put the clause in said contract that gave Bret reasonable creative control in his final 60 days. Reasonable is a funny word that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Probably not the smartest thing for Vince to agree to, but he did. He's the one who put the title on Bret Hart that summer. And then a month later told Bret, I can't afford to pay you anymore. Would you take a pay cut now, and I'll make it up to you on the back end of this 20-year deal. I owe you one, pal. I owed you one, pal, Bret Hart, long before he ever did CM Punk. And Bret said no, wisely. And Vince said, well, I'm breaching your contract because I can't pay you. So I'm going to breach your contract so you can go negotiate with WCW. You have my blessing. Go talk to Eric Bischoff. He's the one who then went back to Bret a month or two later and said, just kidding. I can afford to pay you now. Now I have the money. But by that point, Bret was already talking to WCW. I don't even think the deal was done. Technically, he may have been able to pull out, but he was deep in negotiations at that point with WCW, and he ended up signing with them. And he is the one, Vince is, who booked the match between him and Shawn Michaels for the Survivor Series in the first place. The same Shawn Michaels Bret Hart could not stand. Claimed Bret did that he was willing to work with him, until Shawn made that comment about, I'm not willing to do the same for you. But still, Bret had no love lost for this guy. You knew there were issues between these two. The same Shawn Michaels that Bret got into a hair-pulling match with backstage a few months earlier. Yes, it was the biggest possible match they could promote. I know why they would want to do it. But he booked himself into a corner. He did it to himself. But boy, did it pay off handsomely for him in the end. But it's amazing to look back now at how much wrestling has changed in the 22 years since that match to even conceive of something like this happening now, today, is impossible. You have younger fans now who are probably listening to this podcast right now, or who may just watch the Vice special, and they have no concept of how this stuff used to be, or why the championship was so important back then, who probably look at that now and go, what a silly, stupid thing to get so worked up about. Like today, if Vince wanted the belt off Brock Lesnar, if Brock Lesnar was still Universal Champion and Lesnar refused, Vince would turn around and just announce that the title was vacant and he would make a new belt and nobody would bat an eyelash. And if Brock took the fruit roll-up belt to another company, I don't even think the stock price would so much as budge, let alone would the company implode or suffer some kind of mortal blow. It all just seems so comical now that such a big deal was made about this. But part of me misses that. This idea that the title, that the championship was so important and people took things that seriously. I miss that kind of importance that things like that used to have in wrestling because we don't have that anymore.